Welcome to After Dark Online, Agree to a Degree, Mediated Messaging. My name is Kathleen Maguire, and I'm part of the team that produces After Dark. Though this program is virtual, the Exploratorium is located at Pier 15 in San Francisco on unceded territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. We acknowledge that we are guests on the land and honor their stewardship of the ecology, both past and present. Tonight's program is the final in a series we've presented throughout September, Agree to a Degree. Through these programs, we're exploring choice, how we make personal and collective decisions, what influences our preferences, and how this consensus functions in the political democratic process. You can find past week's programs, which have looked at uncertainty, compliance, and the voting process on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Tonight, we'll be digging into how the information we interact with through social networks and the broader media can be shaped to influence. What are the strategies used by media makers to impact decision making? How does the information you take in, both passively and actively, affect your perspective? And how can you help avoid sharing misinformation throughout your own social networks? The program also includes another fantastic edition of our series, Resonance, Unheard Sounds, Undiscovered Music. This series is about music and sound created or captured in interesting and unusual ways by innovative artists from a variety of fields. Tonight, we're thrilled to dive into the mind of Marshall Trammell, an experimental archivist, percussionist, conductor, and composer. Later on in the program, you'll be hearing from David Rand, Associate Professor of Management Science and Brain, Associate Professor of Management Science and Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, who explores topics such as cooperation, outrage, misinformation, political preferences, and social media platform behavior through a cognitive science grounding. In that talk, Dr. Rand will speak to our current complex media landscape and the ways inaccurate information can flow both intentionally and unintentionally through our social networks. However, I will be your first presenter tonight. My background is in media history, archiving, and preservation. Before getting into the messy media web Dr. Rand will address, I thought we could look towards the media landscape of the past, and we'll share a brief and, in its brevity, a very much incomplete glimpse at historical presidential campaign ads for television. In comparison to the volume of election-based media we encounter now, as well as how chaotic it can be, these historical campaign ads may seem particularly quaint. While this may be true, these historical campaign ads serve much the same purpose as the media we currently encounter, which is to persuade. Like our current media landscape, these ads demand an evaluation of intention, accuracy, purpose, and source. The persuasive techniques used in historical campaign ads have been pretty consistent over time, and the techniques mirror the modes of persuasion that we still see showing up today. Also, while I won't be showing you many ads, they are often very interesting historical documents, both of an election, as well as the sort of televisual or aesthetic style of the time of their creation. And personally, I also think they are often quite entertaining. As the first widespread form of visual mass media, the power of cinema as a persuasive tool was recognized pretty immediately. A pre-foray into cinema that previews what presidential campaign commercials evolved into was the 1944 industrial film Hell Bent for Election. Hellbent fits into what was an outpouring of wartime animated propaganda and was intended to, first, convince the public to register to vote, and then, once registered, to vote for FDR. It was made by UPA, an innovative animation studio, maybe best known for Mr. Magoo, and directed by Chuck Jones. Jones went on to be one of Warner Brothers' best-known animators, directing many beloved Looney Tunes shorts. The film features many of the characteristics that would show up in the earliest campaign commercials. Animations, jingles, and a mostly encouraging outlook, and we'll listen to this jingle for a minute. It's pretty good.
Wanna have security, security, security. Wanna have security, you gotta get out and vote. They're growing big red apples that Hoover is promoting. If you don't want to sell those apples, start voting, man, start voting.
The possibility of television influencing a presidential election was recognized even before the first television campaign commercials, when in 1948, Philadelphia was selected as the location for both the Democratic and Republican conventions. The reason for this was that Philadelphia was the center point of the coaxial cable, which carried television signals from Boston to Richmond, Virginia. This strategic location supported a possible television viewership of up to 10 million for the conventions. In 1952, we see the first presidential campaign commercials from Dwight Eisenhower. When Eisenhower's ads began airing, his opponent, Adlai Stevenson, offered a well-known quote, "I think the American people will be shocked by such contempt for their intelligence. This isn't Ivory Soap versus Palm Olive." His aide, George Ball, offered another famously foreshadowing quip, "Presidential campaigns will eventually have professional actors as candidates." Eisenhower produced many ads. Probably the best remembered is the "I Like Ike" animation made by Walt's brother Roy.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Just get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
However, he created several ads, and some of the most notable were from a series called Eisenhower Answers America. These were created by Rosser Reeves, a pioneer of early television advertising and an executive with many successes, including coining the M&M slogan, "They melt in your mouth, not in your hands." Eisenhower was uncomfortable with the idea of TV commercials, and he was convinced to do them in an effort to shed the public perception that he was wooden. These ads can be found online, and I invite you to seek them out.
My answer? It's not a one-agency mess, or even a one-department mess. It's a top-to-bottom mess. And I promise we will clean it up from top to bottom.
And you can consider as you watch if you think he was able to shed that wooden image. Eisenhower filmed these commercials over the course of one day. And in him, the answers that you hear are from a longer form speech that he gave. The questions were crafted after the fact and sort of tried to draw from the best sound bites that emerged from that speech. Since this foray into presidential campaign ads in 1952, for the most part, campaign ads have fallen into a handful of broad, persuasive approaches, with 4 approaches that show up the most often. Biographical commercials that introduce you to, humanize, or simply vaguely celebrate a candidate. Feel-good ads, which often present an idealized America that only the candidate who's presenting those ads can lead towards. fear-based ads that indulge in the horrific truth of the future to come should you vote for the wrong candidate, and those often historically have featured children. And attack ads, which are the candidates at their worst, direct attacks on their opponent's policies or their opponent's character. I've given longer versions of this talk before, and there are many fascinating examples of campaign ads that I'm sad to skip. However, to keep things brief, I thought I'd hone in on two of the most notable presidential campaign ads: Ronald Reagan's Prouder, Stronger, Better, which is also sometimes called Morning in America, from 1984, and Lyndon Johnson's Peace Little Girl, which is often referred to as Daisy Girl, from 1964. Both of these campaigns are considered to have produced ads that were very effective, influential, and also have sort of made an impression on our cultural memory. One callback worth noting is that as a former professional actor, Reagan did fulfill Adlai Stevenson's aide's George Ball's fears. So Reagan was a rare candidate who approached almost all of his commercials from a feel-good approach, even in his 1980 campaign, which unfolded during the Iranian hostage crisis. This feel-good genre of persuasive technique usually has a tenuous relationship with the core issue of an election, and the ads have historically not been considered effective in getting decided voters to reevaluate or even helping undecided voters move towards a candidate. They mostly serve to reinforce a voter's interest in a candidate they already support, and historically have been the most effective with incumbent candidates. However, in his 1984 campaign, Reagan showed an untouchable mastery of positive campaigning, anchored by one of the most remembered and effective campaign commercials ever produced: Prouder, Stronger, Better. The tone is driven by a maudlin score that reappears throughout his campaign.
More men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon,
the ad is inspirational, aspirational, and nostalgic. Spoken text, carefully selected imagery, and efficient editing merge to create a dreamy glimpse of true American happiness. However, embedded within the ad are allusions to where the US was 4 years prior, before Reagan was first elected, to highlight that, in Reagan's view, the US had emerged from the darkness of the late 70s and was finally enjoying the brilliant sunrise of morning it so deserved. Not mentioned are the points Reagan had been struggling with and how he would address those, such as unemployment and a growing deficit, his fragile approval rating, or a commitment to improving in a second term. Reagan's 1984 ads were created not by a sort of superstar ad agency as most are, but a hand-picked assemblage of 40 individual superstars who together were dubbed Tuesday Team Inc. The ads were mostly written by Hal Riney of San Francisco's Ogilvy and Mather. Riney was known for his skills in indulging in the emotional, and he's also the narrator of Prouder, Stronger, Faster. And from this optimism, we'll move into something that may feel a little more familiar right now: negative commercials. Negative campaign ads spur a lot of debate regarding their overall effectiveness and what they even are. When polled, voters often say they dislike negative campaign commercials. However, some researchers suspect it's primarily attack ads that voters are referencing, and ads purely aiming to exploit anxiety. Historically, though, negative ads have received the most attention, and interestingly, the scholar John Geer, who wrote In Defense of Negativity, Attack Ads in Presidential Campaigns, argues that negative ads actually tend to be some of the richest in imparting facts about a candidate's treatment of an issue, because to attack requires evidence, which serves the prospective voter with some basic information that they could look into. Lyndon B. Johnson's 1964 campaign was considered a watershed year for negativity, with Johnson creating many effective, hugely negative ads, and his opponent, Barry Goldwater, most often operating on the defensive. His ads throughout the campaign fell into two categories: Children in Peril and In Your Guts, You Know He's Nuts, his attack ads on Barry Goldwater. The Johnson campaign produced what is probably the most influential presidential campaign ad, Peace Little Girl, also often referred to as Daisy Girl. This ad was broadcast only once as a paid advertisement on September 7th, 1964, during NBC's Monday Night at the Movies, which at that time would have been like the family gathered around the TV and everybody truly watching the same thing. Peace Little Girl is considered to be something of a game-changing campaign spot. There were negative ads before. However, at the time, this ad was shocking in the lengths it went to in its attack. Barry Goldwater is not mentioned by name, and neither of the candidates' images are shown, which was also a new technique and one that showed great confidence that the public is well aware of the issues and the implications of the ad. It also diverges from Geer's argument that attack ads often require more policy discussion than other approaches. And in this case, the function of the ad was in no way educational, but entirely psychological and playing into the public's anxiety around war and nuclear arms, as well as a sort of narrative that the Johnson campaign had been building around Barry Goldwater throughout all of their media-based outreach. While the Johnson campaign pulled the ad immediately, in part because of the furious reaction of the Goldwater campaign, which they had anticipated, it was shown and discussed endlessly in the news. And this is a much more pervasive way of getting a message out than repeatedly airing the spot, and much cheaper too, since the campaign did not have to purchase television time. And while these tools being used are more rudimentary than what we might currently have and what Dr. Rand will be discussing, the strategy certainly has parallels to the contemporary media landscape. While this overview is extremely limited, if you'd like to dig in, I highly recommend checking out the Museum of the Moving Images project, The Living Room Candidate. It's a web-based project that the Museum of the Moving Image began over 2 decades ago and continued to evolve. It includes over 300 presidential campaign commercials with extensive context, separated by year, curated collections. There's obviously sort of a lot to pick apart or frames to look at these ads through. And what I really like about this project is that it supports you being able to have access to a lot of different types of information around these campaign ads. There's also a really interesting project that 2 artists, Antony Mutanda and Marshall Reeves, have been working on for 36 years, or 10 elections. It's an evolving documentary called Political Advertisement, which each year adds new advertisements and really encompasses the entire history of political TV campaign ads for presidential elections. This is something you usually can only see in the theater, so a little hard to do right now, but I have seen that nationally it is being shown some places. Now I'll pass this on to Dr. David Rand. David Rand is the Irwin H. Schell Professor and an Associate Professor of Management Science and Brain and Cognitive Sciences at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's an affiliate of the MIT Institute for Data, Systems, and Society, and the director of the Human Cooperation Laboratory and the Applied Cooperation Team. Bridging the fields of cognitive science, behavioral economics, and social psychology, David's research combines behavioral experiments run online and in the field with mathematical and computational models to understand people's attitudes, beliefs, and choices. His work uses a cognitive science perspective grounded in the tension between more intuitive versus deliberative modes of decision-making. He focuses on illuminating why people believe and share misinformation, understanding political psychology and polarization, and promoting human cooperation. David received his BA in computational biology from Cornell University and his PhD in systems biology from Harvard University. His work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Nature, Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the American Economic Review, Psychological Science, Management Science, and the American Journal of Political Science. He has also written popular press articles for outlets that include the New York Times, Wired, New Scientist, and the Psychological Observer. His talk tonight looks at understanding and reducing the spread of misinformation online. Here's David.
All right, thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak. I'm going to tell today a bit about work that I've been doing with my research group on understanding and reducing the spread of misinformation online. Now, I think that this is a topic that has been in the news a lot lately, and it's been sort of top of mind for everyone, but I want to start with some definitions, because when people use a lot of the relevant terms here, different people mean different things. And so I'm going to use the term fake news or false news. When I say that, I don't mean anything you disagree with, but I'm specifically talking about entirely fabricated stories that are presented as if they're legitimate pieces of news. And this has gotten the lion's shares of attention when people have been talking about misinformation online, and it's important and is something that I'll talk about. But I think another category of misinformation that's probably much more prevalent and much more important is what we call hyperpartisan news. So this is biased or misleading coverage of events that did actually happen. So no, it's not entirely fabricated, it's just misleading. And so everything that I'm going to talk about sort of pertains to both of these kinds of misinformation. And so the main question that I'm going to talk about today is what can be done to try and fight misinformation online. And there are sort of two dominant approaches for this in the current media ecosystem. The first one, given that most of this is happening on social media platforms, which are first and foremost tech companies, is a tech solution, which is using machine learning and artificial intelligence to develop classifiers that identify misinformation and then allow the platforms to downrank it so people are less likely to see it, or tag it with warnings, or various kinds of interventions like that. And machine learning is very powerful, can do many things very well, but evidently identifying misinformation is not one of them, based on the fact that there continues to be lots of online misinformation problems. And a lot of the challenge for machine learning is that because truth is not a very clear, cut and dry concept, it's hard to create good training sets that the models can use to learn what's true and what's not. And also, there's a problem that misinformation is constantly evolving, and so the signatures that might identify misinformation at one time don't wind up being that helpful in the future, as seen, for example, by the COVID-19 pandemic, where all of a sudden there was a whole new class of COVID-related misinformation that was different from, say, some of the political misinformation that had been going around before, and so caused issues for the classifiers. So that's one approach, is let the machine sort it out. And the other approach that social media platforms have been using a lot involves bringing in humans, and in particular experts and professional fact checkers. So this is partnerships with sites like Snopes.com or PolitiFact, where you have trained experts that spend substantial amounts of time researching articles and deciding whether they're true or not, and then writing up little summaries about why they support the article or why they think it's false. And professional fact checking has the potential to really be useful, but it has some substantial problems. Most notably, it doesn't scale. So it takes 1 second to, even computers can generate misinformation sort of automatically, whereas it takes a long time for fact checkers to go and actually engage in the fact checking and write up the fact checks. And so there's just no possible way that professional fact checkers can come anywhere close to keeping up with the sort of stream of misinformation that's being produced. And so what I'm going to talk about today is two alternatives that sort of leverage cognitive science to try and understand why it is that people share misinformation, and therefore what we can do about it. And so starting with this question of why people share inaccurate content, there's various possible explanations. The first sort of most obvious explanation is that they simply don't know that it's false. And so, it's just sort of simple confusion. Everyone's really doing their best. People are only sharing things they think they're accurate. They're just mixed up. And so to try and assess how well this explanation can account for the sharing of misinformation, we ran a survey experiment in which we recruited over 1,000 Americans. We showed them a set of 24 headlines where they were sort of balanced, half were true, half were false, half were sort of right-leaning, half were left-leaning. And what we did is we randomized what we asked them. And so in the accuracy condition, so half of the people, when they were shown the headline in sort of Facebook format like this, they were asked, to the best of your knowledge, is the claim in the above headline accurate? And they would just respond no or yes. And the other half of the people in the sharing condition, they were asked, shown exactly the same thing, but asked, would you consider sharing this story online, for example, through Facebook or Twitter? And so what this lets us assess is how well people can tell truth from falsehood and how those sort of accuracy ratings compare to the actual sharing decisions. So what I'm going to show you is I'm going to break down the headlines for whether they were false or true, and whether they aligned with the participants' ideology or they, basically political alignment. So these are the headlines that don't align with the ideology. So a Republican judging a sort of Democrat slant headline, for example, and ones that align. So this is like a Democrat rating a Democratic leaning headline. Okay, so I'm going to show you the fraction of headlines that were rated as accurate as a function of their actual veracity and their political alignment. And what you see is that the true headlines in orange are rated as way more accurate than the false headlines in green. And political alignment has a very small effect. So the headlines that align with ideology are rated as a bit more true than the ones that don't, but this effect is much smaller than actual veracity. So basically, they're not perfect, but people are not terrible at telling true from false, particularly sort of on average. And so the question is, okay, if sharing of misinformation is just about getting confused, then when we look at sharing, the pattern should be pretty similar. But in fact, we see a really markedly different pattern, where here, stories that align with the person's ideology are much more likely to be shared than headlines that aren't, and the actual truth of the headline has very little impact on sharing. So there's this big disconnect, and this is in particular emphasized if you compare headlines that are false but aligned with the participant's ideology. What you see is that for these headlines, people are more than twice as likely to say they would share the headline if they're asked about sharing as they are to say that the headline is true when they're asked about accuracy. And so this means there's a large chunk of misinformation sharing that is not attributable just to confusion. So, okay, what is going on with these headlines? A sort of natural explanation, and something that's gotten a lot of traction in sort of popular discussion of this, is that we're in a post-truth era where people simply don't care about accuracy anymore, or at least they don't care about accuracy as much as they care about lots of other things like partisanship. And that would seem to explain this result. But if you actually just explicitly ask people, when you're deciding whether to share a piece of content on social media, how important is it to you that it's, surprising, politically aligned, funny, interesting, or accurate? What you see is that people overwhelmingly say that it's very important to share content that's accurate, or to not share the content that's inaccurate, and that they say that this is more important than anything else. And so obviously, you can't take these ratings totally at face value, because people might just be saying what they think the experimenter wants them to say, or they say the thing that sounds good. But this is at least some first pieces of evidence that it's not necessarily just that people don't care about accuracy at all. At least explicitly, people do care about accuracy. And so in our work, we're suggesting a third alternative to either confusion or purposeful sharing of false content because you just don't care about accuracy, which is that the problem is that maybe people are just distracted. Particularly on social media, there are lots of social motivations like validation and reinforcement and signaling your group membership, and wanting people to like your post and follow your accounts. And that these social motivations maybe distract you from accuracy, such that if you had remembered to think about accuracy, you would really care about it and not want to share inaccurate things, but you just forget to do so. And the implication of this is that by design, social media platforms interfere with the consideration of accuracy by focusing you on all this other stuff. So if this inattention account of misinformation sharing is right, then it should be that if you simply get people to think about accuracy a little bit, that should improve the quality of what they share. So to test that, we've run a series of experiments, one of which I'll show you here. We again show participants a series of headlines in Facebook format, half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning. And in the control condition, just for each headline, we ask, if you were to see it on Facebook, how likely would you be to share it? And consistent with what I showed you before, people are not very discerning. Their likelihood of sharing was roughly equal for true and false headlines. They were more or less not discerning at all in their sharing. And then in the treatment condition, everything is exactly the same, but for every article, first we ask, to the best of your knowledge, how accurate is the claim in the headline? And then we go on to say, if you were to see it on Facebook, how likely would you be to share it? So we sort of force them to consider the accuracy of the headline before they decide whether to share it or not. And what we see is, relative to the control, there's a large drop in their probability of sharing the false headlines. They're half as likely to share false headlines after we make them consider accuracy compared to the control. Now, furthermore, because we ask for their accuracy judgments in the treatment, we can say in this, roughly 15% of false headlines where people were saying they were likely to share them, we can break it down by what fraction of these headlines were headlines that people thought were true. So this was like a confusion-based sharing, which they were doing their best. They thought it was true, but they were wrong. And how much of it was purposely sharing something that they thought was probably not true. And so if you break it out like that, what you see is that most of the sharing of false headlines that occurs when they're thinking about accuracy is due to confusion. So this is people thinking it's accurate, even though it wasn't. And more precisely, we can say that about half of the sharing of misinformation was due to inattention, just forgetting to think about accuracy. A third of it was due to confusion, incorrectly thinking it was true when you were considering accuracy. And only a sixth of it is this kind of post-truth disregard for accuracy and purposeful sharing of content that you believe to be false. So we think that this presents some evidence supporting the idea that inattention is really a primary driver of misinformation sharing. Now, in that experiment, we really kind of force people to consider accuracy before sharing, which is not kind of practical. Facebook is not going to put that accuracy question before every item that you see, every story you see on Facebook. But we've also shown that there's many ways that you can, in a much more gentle way, just nudge people to consider accuracy. For example, at the beginning of the study, you can just show them a random headline and say, how accurate do you think this headline is? Then it sort of just makes the concept of accuracy top of mind. We can provide sort of minimal digital literacy tips like be skeptical of headlines, investigate the source, watch for unusual formatting, check the evidence. These are kind of things that aren't really probably teaching people things they didn't know already. It's just making the concept of accuracy more salient. Or you could ask them a question of how important is it to you that you only share articles that are accurate? Almost everybody says important, and then it's kind of top of mind for them going forward of, oh, I should be thinking about accuracy. And this is particularly effective if it's also combined with some social norms messaging saying that other people think it's really important to only share accurate content. And so in more of these survey experiments, we found that all of these different approaches to gently nudging people to consider accuracy successfully increase sharing discernment. And by a lot, they usually maybe around double how discerning people are. So double the difference in sharing between true and false headlines. And we found that this is true regardless of whether the headlines align with your ideology or not, We've also done a bunch of COVID-19 studies, and we find that also works for information and misinformation related to COVID-19. And it works for both Democrats and Republicans, so it's not specific, to one ideological group. And so I think that this means that this is a promising approach for getting people to share higher quality content. Now, I think, as I said, this evidence is all promising, but so far, everything that I've told you about is using these survey experiments. And what we really want to know is, does this work in the wild? So we did a field experiment where we wanted to see what's the effect of sending a direct message about accuracy to Twitter users. What effect does that have on the news that they subsequently tweet? Basically, can we deploy this intervention ourselves in a real world sharing setting where people don't know that they're part of an experiment? So in order to do that, we created a series of accounts, sort of with a neutral, they sort of self-described as bots and not anything political. It was the cooking bot. And using these accounts, we followed over 130,000 Twitter users who had recently shared links to either Breitbart or InfoWars, to sites that regularly share misinformation. Of those 136,000 people, about 11,000 of them followed our account back. And so now those are followers of our accounts and people that we can send messages to. And so that sort of forms our baseline subject pool. And then we filtered it down to about 5,000 subjects who were likely not bots themselves, and who had recently shared news, and so seemed like sort of active news sharers. Then for those 5,000 odd subjects, our account sent them this direct message, which says, how accurate is this headline? Accurate, underlined in red, shows them some random non-political headline, and basically says, how accurate do you think this headline is? I can't tell. Now, almost nobody responds to the message, but that's fine. We don't need a response. As long as they opened it and even just read the opening sentence at the top, how accurate is this headline? That's enough for them to have been treated. And so for the idea of accuracy to be made top of mind for them. Then what we did is we compared the quality of the links, the news sources that people shared links to in the 24 hours after they received this message, compared to all the people that had not yet received the message. And this allows us to do causal inference and to determine what is this sort of causal impact of getting this accuracy reminder on the quality of content that the people shared. And it's one way to visualize the results. What I'm going to show you here is one circle per news source, where the size of the circle is proportional to the number of tweets to that news source among the people in our subject pool that haven't been treated yet. And then on the x-axis, you're going to see how trustworthy that news source is according to professional fact checkers. And on the y-axis, you're going to see the change in fraction of tweets pointing to that news source as a function of receiving our message. So positive values means the message increased the share of tweets to that news source, and negative values means our accuracy message decreased the fraction of tweets to that news source. And remember, we're selecting users who at baseline were sharing a lot of misinformation. And so what we see is, first of all, you can tell from the size of the circles that at baseline, these people are sharing a lot of Fox News and Breitbart and some Daily Caller, Daily Wire, Western Journal, which are these kind of right-leaning hyperpartisan sites, and not very much of more mainstream sites like New York Times, CNN, Washington Post. But then what you see in terms of looking at this sort of shape on the y-axis is that our little accuracy minder substantially increases their probability of sharing links to mainstream sites and decreases the share of their tweets to the really right-wing sort of hyperpartisan sites. And there's a very strong correlation between the change in tweet frequency as a result of our message and how much fact checkers say that the news source is trustworthy. We see that the treatment more than triples the user's level of discernment, so difference in number of tweets to mainstream versus hyperpartisan or fake news sites. among users that tweeted, that translates into about a 5% increase in average quality of news sources they share. And importantly, we found that the treatment was as effective, if not even more effective, for users that had lots of followers compared to users that had very few followers. And so our suggestion is this can easily translate into an effective intervention that social media companies could implement, where, for example, as you're scrolling through your news feed, occasionally you'll get a pop-up that says, you know, help us inform our algorithms. How accurate do you think this headline is? People can either just click accurate or inaccurate, then go back to their feed. And the idea is, even if you throw away the answers to this question, just asking the question helps prime the concept of accuracy and make accuracy more top of mind for users while they're going through their feed. And this is attractive because it provides this distributed tool for reducing misinformation. You don't need a centralized definition of true where the platform is deciding which things are true and which ones are false and what they should get rid of. And instead, it relies on people's own ability to tell what's accurate when they sort of bother to think about accuracy. And it's also scalable. It doesn't have this problem of fact checkers needing to keep up with the stream of misinformation being produced. And we think that, if platforms took this seriously, they could invest a lot of resources in figuring out what's the optimal way to do it, how to most effectively deliver the treatment. It's also not something that only is in the hands of platforms. You can do the same thing by using advertisements to deliver little cards that say, how accurate do you think this headline is? Think about accuracy, etc. And you could use those ads targeted at people that you have reason to believe would be sharing misinformation. So this is a way that civil society organizations could also be using these approaches to try and improve the quality of information shared online. And you can regularly change the format so that people don't start blocking it out and ignoring it. And so in sum for this, we think that these accuracy nudges can really be an important part of an anti-misinformation toolkit that are currently not getting taken advantage of all by platform companies, and in fact, quite the opposite. Now, the last thing that I want to tell you about is, I was saying here that if you threw away the answers to this question, it would still be very helpful just by nudging people to think about accuracy. But the last thing I want to talk about is, what about the actual answers to questions like these? Does having lay people rate the accuracy of headlines give you some useful insight into what's actually true and what's not? Or in other words, is it possible to use crowdsourcing to help make fact-checking scalable? So as I said at the beginning, the problem with fact-checking by professionals is there's not very many professional fact-checkers, and it takes a really long time, so it can't scale. But it's easy to recruit lots of lay people and have them just look at headlines or things like that and give their ratings. The problem, of course, is that fact checkers are trained professionals, and so there's no reason to expect that lay people would actually be good at identifying reliable or unreliable sources or accurate or inaccurate articles. And that's where the concept of the wisdom of crowds enters, where across a lot of different domains, there's evidence that even though individual lay people may not be very good, if you average them, then you wind up with responses that can be remarkably accurate. So we tested this in a couple of ways. In one study, we showed lay people a set of 60 news outlets. A third of them were fake news sites, a third of them were hybrid partisan sites, and a third of them were mainstream media sites. And we asked them to rate how much they trusted each site. And here I'm going to break it down by the responses among Democrats and among Republicans. And what you see is that there are partisan differences where the Republicans trust Fox more than they trust any of the other sites, and the Democrats trust, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post more than they trust any other sites. But these sort of partisan differences are actually smaller than the differences between mainstream and any of the misinformation sites. So, like, the average Republican trusts Fox more than CNN, but trusts CNN more than Breitbart. And the average Democrat trusts CNN more than Fox, but trusts Fox more than left-leaning sites like Daily Kos or Common Dreams. And so what this means is that if you just create a politically balanced layperson rating, so you average the ratings of the Democrats and the Republicans, every single mainstream site does better than every single hyperpartisan or fake news site. And the layperson ratings are extremely highly correlated with the professional fact checker ratings, in large part because the fact checkers and the lay people of both political stripes all gave very low trust ratings to the hyperpartisan and fake news sites. So that's sort of promising for identifying credible or non-credible sources. But the last thing that we wanted to know is, can the lay people actually successfully identify the veracity of individual articles? And so in this project, we took a set of around 200 headlines that an internal Facebook algorithm had flagged as potentially problematic and needing fact checking. And using this like sort of directly relevant set of headlines, we had 3 fact checkers research each article and determine how true it was. And then we also showed just the headline and lead sentence to a bunch of lay people and had them rate how accurate they thought it was. And what I'm showing here is the correlation between the layperson ratings and the fact checker ratings as a function of the number of layperson ratings there are per headline. And so then you want to know, well, how good, okay, say there's a correlation of 0.6. Is that good or is that not good? And so what we thought is a natural baseline was just the level of agreement amongst the fact checkers themselves, because the 3 fact checkers were not in agreement all the time about all the headlines. And so in blue here, this blue dotted line shows the average correlation amongst the 3 fact checkers. And what this result is saying is that with just 10 or 15 lay people only reading the headline, you get as high of a correlation between that and the fact checkers as you get amongst the fact checkers themselves going off and doing really detailed research. And so this suggests that crowdsourcing can be a really powerful tool for helping make fact checking scalable. Just to summarize, relying on professional fact checkers and machine learning to identify misinformation is useful and important part of the approach, but it's not anywhere near to enough to really solve the misinformation problem. And our work suggests that lay people are surprisingly good at identifying information quality if they pay attention. And so that means that platforms can get people to just share better content in the first place by nudging them to think about accuracy. And it means that platforms can leverage this sort of like crowd intelligence to help identify low quality sites and low quality sources and low quality articles in a scalable way. And together, these both present scalable solutions that critically don't rely on a centralized authority deciding what content to censor and what content to let through, but rather it does it in this kind of distributed sort of crowd fashion. And so I think these are really important approaches that platforms, if they adopted, could really use to make a substantial dent in the misinformation problem. The one major caveat to give at the end is that almost all of our work has focused on the US. And it's super important to assess how well all of these results generalize cross-culturally, given that misinformation is a problem that is global. It's not confined to the US. And so before any of these things were rolled out globally, it's important to check how well it works in whatever particular target population one is interested in. And so with that, I want to thank my co-authors. Gord Pennycook is my sort of main partner in crime for everything misinformation related. And then there are various other students and postdocs and colleagues that have worked with us on these projects, as well as our funders and you all for your attention. So thanks so much.
Up next, Resonance with Marshall Trammell. Marshall is a music research strategist performing political education on and beyond the limits of the bandstand. He is an experimental archivist, percussionist, conductor, and composer. His aesthetics and activism are centered in social change interventions and generate new, local and global ecologies that embrace improvisation as a collective movement-building tool in the creation of post-capitalist imaginaries. Trammell's work also uses political aesthetic theory, data creation, mapping, and collective music and art making in order to step out of the domain of traditional cultural institutions, relocating the act of co-production back into the community. And we feel so honored that Marshall has taken the time to bring us in to see his work and hear more about his process. Here's Resonance.
Hi, I'm Wayne Grimm, and I'd like to welcome you to Resonance. Tonight we'll be working with percussionist and activist Marshall Trammell. He's a mid-career, multidisciplinary, visionary artist, keenly focused on investigating social practices, sense-making, and aesthetic technologies embedded in indigenous design principles and weaponizing culture. He's a multi-percussionist centered in African and diasporic principles. Today he performs research and political education internationally from a platform for embodied social justice vernacular, organizational strategy, alternative infrastructure, and solidarity economic development. Please welcome Marshall Trammell. welcome, Marshall. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Wayne. It's great to be back.
It was a really beautiful little set you played. And I'd like to just ask you if you can describe what you do for people who maybe aren't familiar with your music or your work.
Wow, it's a good question. Good place to start. One thing I do is that I activate common knowledge in a way. Like I perform ancestral music, and I reference that. I perform it traditionally on with hand drums, and study the mechanics of certain things, and I apply that to what I call critical creative music on the drum set, applied to the drum set. Creative music is this lineage, and that's important, and the critical nature of its existence and relationship to this moment in history, like, is important to any utterance I poke at the drum. So oftentimes, wanting to make the music more accessible to working class people, as I anchor it in these traditions and these things, and that helps me to move through them and then to elevate the art. So I like to return to recognizable cadences or what you might whatever call them, and then but also to illustrate expanding those ideas and inventing something new in that moment of performance.
And I wonder, is that related to the work that you do as a music research strategist? Those are sort of like two sides of the same coin, I guess.
Sure. So Sun Ra's work is often remembered for what comes out of our speakers at home. And what's forgotten a lot is that he was an exhorter. He would be on a street corner talking to people about his research and Egyptology, like different biblical things, and analysis and synthesis of being Black in America. So much so that he's from somewhere else. Like he's like, this place, there's problems here. So the same thing I experienced. Like people enjoy Charlie Parker's music, and so much so they make money doing this music. But the conditions, right, of coal, like hard coal and pressure makes diamonds. People like the diamonds, they're not really concerned about the dynamics of the coal mine.
Right.
And so what I want to express is that lineage. Like, it's not maybe how well I play the drums, but there are these people and conditions that are powers greater than ourselves, that I need to explicate, like beyond the bandstand. What do people in the audience take home? Do they take home how well I did a drum roll, or do they take home how well this group of people communicated in this space? If it's a bar, if it's here, how did that transform something of their evening? And then maybe they can talk about something.
Yeah.
So I try to instigate that through participatory research and presenting the work not as Marshall Trammell, the artist, but this research entity that is investigating things.
Right. Great. It's very much involving different communities. And you mentioned earlier that there's some component of kind of self-defense and martial arts in your work, in your research, and your sort of ideas. Sure.
I think if you're ever like in a blue mood, or if you're like walking down the street and some people might get you, what do? You might whistle to yourself, whistle a little song, okay? I need to get to the car, And then when do we need music? It's like when we're, when we're happy, but also know that there's the opposite is out there. I look at the history of recording and Black people's involvement in the market. And the technology, the limited technology that Baraka, that Leroy Jones talks about in Blues People, like we're going back to that, remembering reading that and thinking about, well, blues isn't necessarily like a 12-bar framework that's 3 minutes long. That is the structure of the technology at the time, and then the markets owned by racists that were controlling that. So our communities are always needing self-defense. If it's our cultural weaponry, if it's real weaponry, bullets, if it's how we educate, teaching kids to put their hands up when they see a cop, and then you got people who are rapping and putting all this music out in the world, and it is a kind of self-defense. We have to inoculate ourselves or distance ourselves from violences that are really often ignored by my comrades, like my people I've been playing music with for 30 years. They're not coming to me and talking about that.
Yeah.
White or black or Asian and Native, whatever they are. So in terms of physical, so self-defense is an embodied practice. So and an embodied cognitive practice. And when you do physical self-defense and you walk in some place, you're thinking, I could probably take this person, I could probably get away, and that's really helpful, having situational awareness. And as these attacks are coming at us more and more, thug, supremacists, whatever they are, they're driving into cities and, terrorizing people.
Yeah.
And then they're terrorizing people at the ballot box, they're terrorizing us at the pharmacy, So so I want to perform with people, and but I also want people to perform with me. And I, for a long time, be asked to play drums and free jazz things, but there was so little or no discourse about the realities that I had to go through to get to that gig,
right.
and the realities that, say, my white counterpart didn't have to go through.
Yeah, exactly.
So I need that to be a part of who I share the stage with, who I work with, that we have an embodied consciousness about where we are, and then at the same time, physical self-defense, and then playing the drums. There's this natural relationship to kinesthetic practices.
Yeah.
That's transforms, transforms my consciousness in a way, and then the ensemble playing, we actually are touching someone, say contact improvisation, working with contact improvised dancers transformed the way that I was performing in the 2000s, because they embody what we're doing musically. They're actually guiding each other's bodies and then creating forms and narratives that are always shifting. And then to be a part of that is a very tactical thing as a musician. Very transformative thing. And I find that through the technologies of isometric practices and working on self-defense with people, we communicate in ways that, like I said, beyond the limits of the bandstand, but these technologies of improvisation don't have to sit in the consciousness of people who are musicians. Actually, they're a manifestation of other things happening. Right. So we're focusing on the record, what Charlie Parker is doing, but actually there are other mechanisms of resilience, of music and harmony that are happening in communities that are just reflected on the stage, but we honor the stage. But so this work is about how we operate in communities.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about that next, about improvisation, because it seems like that is very much part of this research and this self-defense and this thinking about, how you can get through these really difficult situations and sort of also communicate with people. So how did you come to discover improvisation, or that you felt like that was where you needed to be musically?
In the 90s, I was in San Francisco, and some of the older jazz musicians who were my age, or creative musicians, were drug addicts. They were addicts in recovery. And I didn't know that, I didn't see that. Even though my mother, I'm a child of alcoholic and child of domestic violence, but I didn't really see that amongst the people. And then I realized that that was going on. And then I also realized I was kind of feeling crazy being in the city and playing the drums and playing creative music. And one of the things that we did living in the Mission District in the mid-90s was that we, I was a squatter in San Francisco, and I was almost within 2 months of being a San Francisco State student, and I was already an activist, but in San Diego, but I was already evicted after 2 months, and then I started squatting. So I hung out, I got connected with Homes Not Jails and Food Not Bombs and the Epicenter Zone, which was like a punk cultural center in San Francisco, and they put me right in touch. They had these switchboards, the pre, cell phones really. So I started squatting, and then and going to school, and I was a writing major. Eventually, my colleagues were anarchist communities, and we started doing projects with unhoused people who used to live where the stadium is now, over there, wherever that is, King Street, And so we used to just get our friends to give us T-shirts, like all these punk T-shirts, and then instead of setting up little care packages like the nuns were doing, we set up our van, like my roommate's tour van, as a store. We call it the Traveling Free Store. So through that work, through working with Homes Not Jails and the Homeless Advocacy Project, I was doing ad hoc things, but also got to work with homeless advocacy organizations and would recognize how they're improvising. So we got these people who have to. Their daily thing is they got to go collect cans all over the place, and they're improvising in everyday life with capital I. And then, as a musician, I'm like pretending to improvise on the drum set. Like, what am I doing? What is my role in, what am I doing as a musician? What does it have to do with anything else besides myself? Is something that I ask myself, and I like to get with people who are asking themselves that. So that was a major thing of just being involved in direct service and advocacy for unhoused people, and it's something that I return to, like at some of my work now, and I think it'll continue to be because unhoused people is like it's an emblematic of a failed society. Yeah, and you have like 4,000 people before the crisis. 4,000 homeless people are in Oakland. So we can't blame the crisis on that. But we have a responsibility to think about these things. So try to incorporate that. If I'm going to improvise anything as an artist, I like to think about how the virtues of improvisation exist. How do that manifest out in different places?
Man, that's amazing. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the techniques that you use when you play the drums, for people who are maybe not that familiar with some of these sort of like more intricate, special techniques that you have.
Oh, well, thank you. So thank you very much. A lot of this work comes from a practice and a conception that it's evolving in a way. So in the mid-90s, bass player Lyle Ellis has been a mentor to me and a bunch of other people here in the Bay Area. He's from Canada and worked with Cecil Taylor, worked with Don Cherry. When he was in California, in the San Francisco, in the Haight District, he was able to kind of bless us with the attributes of that experience. And one of the things he would talk about was like, what is mastery? And mastery. So he's like 60 years, just do something for 60 years, you're a master, right? So he said, well, that's like 4 15-year periods. And then he told us this, I was in the first 15-year period. And made me think about how I got there. And then what I wanted to do to complete that period. And then what the hell was I going to do the rest of my life? What did I need to know? And so that's a great place to be. Like, what do you need to know? What do you, to be curious about excavating this craft. And he would do exercises. He would have us stay on the ground with our heads facing each other in a mandala, he called it, and we would put our hands on each other's bellies and just breathe together, right? These are exercises for creative music. He would ask us to, every morning before we spoke, we had to go to our instrument, as I used to play pocket trumpet, and then make a note and then log that note down. So at the end of the month, we had all these notes. And so there were 5 or 6 of us in the group, and so he had like a whiteboard in his apartment, and then we all said notes, and then he made a quick, thing. So he was leading us on these exercises and encouraging us to expand. And one of the most dynamic exercises was he had us all close our eyes, and he led us on a walk through Golden Gate Park. I almost closed my eyes now. And I remember like and so maybe we didn't close our eyes. I think we were just not talking, actually, when I go back. Because I remember seeing a plane and and hearing another, like a car go by, but you can't hear the plane. That cognitive dissonant moment. So we did have our eyes open. We were walking around in quiet. And then we got back to the apartment, went to our instruments, and he said, "Play what you saw." I think he said that, or heard. Now I'm mixing it up. I don't want to give away his stuff, so I'm making it ambiguous on purpose. But that was the beginning of when I started doing this kind of jazz hands thing, right? Jazz hands. That's basically all I'm doing. But but in drumming technique, you can control. Some of my friends here have really nice control, and so in drumming, there's the traditional style where your hands are matched, and then traditional is this obtuse grip. And so I figured out some ways to apply that here, and so I may be applying this vibration and kind of controlling it, and then vibrating, losing control and controlling it. And that's this part of kind of how I live my life anyway. It's kind of in control, and then it's not control, and then it's kind of control. So some of that, it just exists. I'm not like a perfectionist on the drum set at all. But what I realized that actually doing this, preparing for this, and then some other related projects, and thinking back to Lyle Ellis's the notion of mastery, made me think about how I began to do this, and that how it relates to the way that I speak. So this is the utterance on my drums, and I have this understanding. Like when we learn music, you basically learn how. If you learn music, you basically learn how to that there are all these different utterances for whatever, and you can put them together and change them. And if you want to play in a genre, you can play rock and roll, but the drum set is not a rock and roll machine for me. It's not a jazz machine. It's just a tool. Yeah. So it's this tool for my utterance, and then it becomes a tool for my stuttering. And so tracing that backwards, we're talking about historical things that may be made present in the process of learning. So so this work harkens back to just experiencing violence against my mother, my parents' violence against each other, their violence against us, their inabilities or inabilities to I guess meet the dream, of being a family that we had started off, and as a youngster, I believe I stuttered. I don't know if I always stuttered, but thinking back, I know that I don't know if I always did, and I think that there was a moment where I began to do that. And it reminded me of when my mother had stuttered, and we thought that maybe I got it from her. And if I did, I know that she experienced violence as a child in Kansas City, and that her two brothers have speech impediments too. One has been very successful, one is more, is not in that way. And his speech is a big part of it, And so I attribute what I do now to this relationship to violence. I can't ignore it. I can't say those things didn't happen. And then it's like resonant, it's apparent in the way that I speak, and maybe the way that I form things, and then the way that I'm speaking on these drums is this a predominant way of playing. There are different types of styles that I play drums, emulating my favorites, but expanding new things have caused me to modify the drum set with metal, wood and skin, right? Because the skins of the drums aren't really skin, but they represent skin. And so in Cuban music and Haitian music and West African music and other traditional musics, we don't really have cymbals. We don't really have those cymbals. We don't have hi-hats. And so I kind of put those things to the side. I really wanted to focus on, like in hand drumming, you have these different voices. And so that's a big influence on what I'm doing and wanting to draw upon in my performance, and to speak through this, this waves back to this, I don't know what the word, but this I want to like make these connections, right, to my ancestry, my presumed ancestry. I don't know what countries I came from, but those technologies are so prevalent in how I experience culture that it demands personal investigation, and then to make something of that.
It's really remarkable to me how holistic your kind of approach and understanding of what you do is. Like, I feel like you're much more aware of like so many things that are underlying you as a person and your work, and that's hard to get there, I think. But I just want to say that.
Well, it's interesting because everyone has a story, right? Everyone has a story, and then some of this stuff gets shaped by the market too. Like, I'm not trying to let everybody off the hook or let myself off the hook, but you know, I navigate in the global economy, and I want to work in places, and I don't know, I can't do all that other things. But I think we all have the capacity to, if we all wanted to be like neurosurgeons, we would like learn what you need to do that. And we are surgical in our other ways. And so we have great capacity in all these things. What makes sense right now is also, what I'm learning is that the management, and through mismanagement, maybe the management of my projects is also part of my art practice. I don't just want to get on stage and hit. That doesn't feel right to me. But these things make, and part of that, like I mentioned, like I worked with critical resistance and was part, you know, anti-prison industrial complex. And there were times in the Bay Area music scene where I would just drop out. Like Marshall had return phone calls. It's because I was probably doing that type of work. And the improvisation and the community things, that the virtues of improvisation that we think are happening in our sounds happen daily in organizations that are fighting for people's rights. Like we'd have like, and I had wished, and I still wish that, you know, my band projects were that critical or that like on point, because there's music that we make, you know, people do just trying to serve justice and, you know, making sure everyone is there to perform their thing in the world, these improvisations, you know, in the world. And, you know, they're not on social media in the same way that someone shredding on a saxophone is. And they're valued differently. And then musicians here, they're not trying to work with organizations. So one of the things that I've failed with and contending with is, how do I make my work relevant to an organization of formerly incarcerated persons fighting the heaviest shit, you know, and they got kids. And then why should some drummer, you know, what does it mean for me to work with them? Do I, you know, how do I do that? Do I volunteer? How can my art be part of that? And a lot of them don't have time for these things. So I'm interested in how to create those exchanges, particularly in this moment, like cultural weaponry that's based in the same kind of political education relationships that organizations that are addressing, you know, power imbalances and inequity in society or do every day. So I think we can take a lesson from them, and I've created these research opportunities, participatory projects, and I keep going back to different social justice organizations to like get in with them and like elevate the work by the everyday lives of people, and not just be like a craft that I can put on a, you know, on a pedestal. Literally. But I want to do that too. Shoot.
Yeah, well, thank you, man. That's it's really important work, and it's amazing that all the stuff that you're doing is just super. It's just great.
Thank you, Wayne. You inspire me in your personal work and the way that you continue to like reach out to great folks in our community and provide critical creative music venues for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the staff here.